This is going to be on some aspects of culture, and in particular, it's going to be on getting your mind about culture. Culture is vast. Everything that humans imagine and do and have done is culture, and it's invisible. We are filled with routines and attitudes and reactions that we didn't consciously choose. In many cases, they're bad. We don't like them. They're dangerous and they hurt us and others. And we can't seem to get rid of them. And the vastness of culture, everything is culture, and the invisibility of culture are two of the things that cause it to ruin businesses and cause wars and ruin marriages and things like that. Um, most people's approach to culture doesn't have enough sophistication and complexity to handle the vastness that's there. And they're very enormously blunt tools. So it's like trying to fix a watch with a 8-meter diameter silver ball. It's just so blunt. You might be able to mash the watch or bend it, but you're not going to be able to do anything useful and precise with it. So the existing ways that people approach culture are a real opportunity for somebody like me to come along and straighten it up, because the existing ways of approaching it are so pitiful and sloppy and messed up and ill-conceived. First of all, I'm going to talk about a 10-component model of culture, which is vastly more complex than what anybody else has. Now, if culture is everything, then you could make an argument a little bit of complexity in modeling. It's probably going to be needed. It is not some simple little goo that you sort of spread all over people and situations. There are definitions of culture, and everybody in the world has different definitions of their own culture they switch among for sneaky and sometimes charitable purposes, usually sneaky purposes. Associated with each definition is a way they are using their culture or your culture at the moment for a purpose which they've admitted and is decent, or a purpose they haven't admitted, which may be decent or indecent. And that's the beginning of wisdom about culture, that cultures are not neutral, sweet, nice things that are sort of out there and people don't notice, use, and distort them. What we consider culture, we switch among within one paragraph in a conversation, within 10 minutes in a day, with different parts of speaking to the same person. We treat culture as one thing, using one definition for one part of a conversation with someone, and treat it as something very different in another part of the same conversation with the same person, because we got different uses we want to make of it for our own purposes. Cultures are used, and the uses that people have determine what definitions of it they use and switch them up. That's the beginning of wisdom. And most models by other people of culture don't include human intentionality and sneakiness, and therefore they're naive and useless, idealistic crap. Number two, people only mention objects like cultures because they want to do something with them. And they have particular operations that people want to perform on cultures. An incomplete mapping would include recognizing cultures and culture elements, mapping cultures, applying and using cultures, extending cultures, creating cultures, saving cultures that are dying, reforming and updating cultures, killing off cultures we no longer need, splitting cultures that are fat, fusing together different cultures and getting them to be one, or at least to cooperate, penetrating cultures that are new to us, expugning cultures and subcultures from larger cultures they're in, strengthening cultures that are weak, diversifying cultures that are dangerous, in danger of not surviving because they're too uniform, deneuroticizing cultures by bringing to consciousness the cultural elements that are controlling people but that they don't realize are controlling them, transplanting things across cultures so that they actually work in two very different cultures. So these are 16 of the operations that most people commonly want to perform on cultures. But not only operations, associated with all the operations are tools. The only way you can get these operations to occur is to apply tools to culture. So operations and tools go together. And there are tools for assessing cultures. There are assessing the skills of handling culture, for mapping the emotions involved in interacting with cultures. So tools for penetrating cultures. Tools for stopping your automatic responses and substituting more consciously chosen responses, which by rehearsal become automatic later. Response stratifying, which means not letting an individual's unconscious reactions become their interpretation, slowing down their reactions by getting everyone in a group to say what they notice in a situation first, then get everyone in the group to say what they felt at that noticing second, then get everyone in the group to say what did that remind them of or get associated with in their past third, then get everyone to tell you what frameworks of interpretation got called up by those remindings and associations fourth. And then what did that tell them? What did that framework tell them the meaning of the situation was fifth? And then how did that meaning change their likelihood of what they're going to notice in the future or do and act in the future? So those are stratified responding as a method. Problemlessness is a way to deal with the incompetence that your culture is when it's in any other culture or environment without overreacting. Community cabaret is a formal way to use arts to make unconscious cultures visible to people and change them and create new cultures. Countering neurosis, demystifying, demythologizing, and deconstructing cultures, extrapolating extreme products, transplanting practices across cultures, personal quality checklists, plotting meeting behaviors, democratic rules of order, managing by events. All of these are tools for performing the operations on cultures I mentioned earlier. Then after tools and operations, you have traits of cultures that you want to change. That's why you want to operate on cultures, is to change their traits. And you have dimensions of cultures. Now, traits are things like the coherence or fragmentation of a culture, the conformity or diversity of a culture, the staticness or dynamicness of a culture, the seenness or unseenness of cultural elements, the strength or weakness of culture and culture elements, the vitality or deadness, the metaphoricness or the literalness of cultural elements, the depth of elements or the shallowness of elements, either emotionally or cognitively, the representationalness of elements or the isolatedness of elements, the birth processes of elements, the growth processes of elements, the destiny switching processes of elements, the lock-in and self-organized criticality processes of cultures, the goal consistency of cultures, the say-do consistency of cultures, the exceptions that cultures recognize to themselves, and the ability of a culture to handle anxieties through roles and rights, events, and stories, or the anxieties that a culture doesn't handle very well. Now, traits are what I just said, and they are dimensions of culture. In addition, there are at least 64, and I actually use 192 other dimensions of cultures, which are very useful for distinguishing culture. They come from all kinds of sources. 8 of them come from a guy, Hofstede, who 40 years ago did a study of IBM employees all over the world, and using factor analysis came up with 8 factors that largely distinguish these cultures. It turns out that those were useless and largely wrong. And so those 8 factors are just so blunt that you can't do anything with them. Should I be individual at this sake shop? How should I be individual ordering the sushi? How should I be communal at this sake shop? How should I be communal talking to this policeman? Just gives you absolutely no guidance how to interact in the culture. And so we need far more articulated and better organized. And it turns out there are lots of cultural dimensions in anthropology, in political science, in psychology, in engineering that are never taught in Hofstede's cultural work or in anthropology. And so I brought them all together and found there are 192 of them. And I actually plotted the culture of an iPod 4S phone on those 192, and it was amazingly useful. And the people who paid me to do that for them were really happy they had hired me to do that for them. And then we did 192 same dimensions of the culture of users of an iPod, and that told us what the iPhone 5 has to be. It's very interesting. So you have traits of cultures, which are immediate things we want to change about them. And then you have other traits of cultures, which we call dimensions, which you are used mostly to distinguish how cultures are from others and to look at longer range, subtler influences rather than parts that we really want to change right away ourselves. So dimensions of cultures are traits of cultures that we immediately want to change. Too weak, make it stronger. Too strong, make it weaker. Too unified, subdivide it. Too subdivided, make it more unified. And they are aspects of culture which help us distinguish one group from another, and one set of learned routines from another set of learned unconscious routines. But that we don't particularly want to manipulate so much as just recognize. So we have the want to manipulate dimensions, and we have the want to just recognize and handle the effect of dimensions. Then we have social processes, economics of any unit in society, a Boy Scout troop, a woman, wife, husband, child, organization, corporation, the economics of each social entity, the politics of each social entity, the culture of each social entity, and the change processes of each social entity. And any culture dimension can appear in some of those social processes and not in others. And so you'll find in academic processes in Japan, Japanese look very individualistic compared to Americans or Europeans. And in corporations and foreign investments, Japanese look very communal and not very individualistic compared to other nations. They tend to, as groups of companies, invest together. And so dimensions and traits of cultures do not exist in some rule-based way where they always appear everywhere. In fact, they appear in some parts, social processes of society and social entities, and not. And they appear in some social processes of a single person and not in others, and in some social processes of a Boy Scout troop and not in others, and in some social processes of IBM and not in others. One of the big failings of Hofstede was that he assumed all these differences occur in all parts of IBM, which is wrong. Then we have social processes and types of culture. So we have traits and dimensions of culture. Then we have social processes that these dimensions show up in, and then types of culture. And types of culture tend to show up in the same, similar types tend to show up in similar social process mappings. And different types tend to have different social process mappings within a culture. And so some culture types show up more in the economic sphere and less in the political sphere. And other culture types show up more in the political sphere and less in the culture sphere, or more in the change sphere and less in the political sphere. And so there's a social process, and types of culture have this close relationship. And finally, you have powers of culture. There are 9 of them. One of them comes from the invisibility culture. Another one comes from the vastness culture. And then you have the traits of high performance cultures. And you can move the traits of any one culture toward the traits of high performance cultures by applying operations using tools onto the existing traits of culture to move the culture from being one type to another type.